Hi, I'm Daniel Kenney, and this is the story behind my story.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Daniel Kenney.
He enlisted for the money. He stayed for the girl. Gateway to the Galaxy, the new series everyone is talking about, beginning with Book 1, Into the Breach. Frank and Marine Space Corps 1 find themselves across the galaxy in a WWE smackdown with the legions of a boss-level villain. But the party's just getting started. He donned the mantle of a celestial knight to impress a girl, well, an empress. Now destiny's calling in a debt. A lightning-paced military fantasy full of outlandish comedy and impossible situations that will have you hailing for these Marines from the get-go. For fans of Green Lantern and the Stargate universe. Listen to what some readers are saying. This is good stuff. Thanks for the new obsession. I recommend and can't wait for the next book. And the visual pictures and action are amazing. They're getting the band back together, and this time, it's serious nonsense. Pick up the Gateway to the Galaxy series by Jonathan Yanez and J.R. Castle, available now on Amazon.com. There's a link to it in the show notes. Gateway to the Galaxy. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to welcome back my friend Daniel Kenney. Daniel is the best kids fiction writer that I know. He does amazing things. I love his work so much. I told him this the other day that whenever he has a new book come out, I get them for my niece and my nephew. And I think I've collected all of them so far because I love his work so much, and I like to support the stuff that I love. And Dan is just doing it. I mean, month after month, he's really doing it. Dan was on the show with me. Dan's it been like a year and a half ago now? I can't remember.
Yeah, I think it's somewhere. Well, first of all, thank you. That is awesome coming from the man, the myth, the legend, Hank Garner. So thank you. That's amazing. I really appreciate that. I think it was like a year and some change.
Yeah.
Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think so too. A lot has happened since then. But before we kind of go into the new stuff that's going on with you, let's recap a little bit for people that maybe haven't gone that far back in the archives, and new people discover the show all the time. You have a really fantastic story about your journey to becoming an author, and you have a big family. We were talking about that before we recorded. So do I. You have a bigger family than me, but so you have this kind of crazy life, but we all love to watch it unfold on Facebook. And you guys just got back from vacation, and I know last year on vacation, y'all had some stories to tell. Was this year uneventful?
Yeah, this year was super uneventful. It almost makes you wonder, why do you even bother going on vacation if there's no, we had two, I mean, they're not even good stories. My son got pulled over in a kayak by the boat police, which was funny. Like, I didn't even know that could happen.
I didn't either. That's amazing.
So he got pulled over by the boat police in the kayak. So that was funny. And then the other thing was we were coming home. We had already stopped for everybody to use the bathroom. And then, you know how this works. Totally classic. 10 minutes later, Dad, I got to go pee, and there's no way we're going to stop this time, but it's my 5-year-old son, and he can't hold it forever. So my wife, she pulled a bold move. She she grabbed an empty water bottle and she looks at me. She's like, should we just have him go here? And I think to myself, I like the way you're thinking, Teresa. So of course I couldn't give the directions because I'm driving. So I assumed she was giving proper directions, and my wife didn't spell. So there's 5-year-old kids trying to pee in a bottle while he's all buckled in, and it is everywhere. I mean, it's in his face. It's everywhere. So that was funny. But that was it. Just those 2 little stories. Other than that, very uneventful, very happy. But last summer was crazy.
Yeah, your wife had like a major like medical scare, didn't she?
Yeah, so we had all these funny things happen. I mean, the cabin we were staying in, every night chipmunks would run through the living room, and like people were like, what there's chipmunks in the living room. And then I emailed the lady the next day from town. I said, hey, there's chipmunks. And she's like, you know what? After the bear broke into the cabin this winter, I wonder if there's – and I'm like, excuse me, did you say bear broke into the cabin? Like, how did you not mention this on the VRBO site, Bear Visits Cabin? So that was really funny. Anyways, there's all these things that happen on this trip, and then we're on our second to last day. Great hike. You know, carrying the kids up the mountain. My wife is like, we've hiked the whole time, so she's really feeling good. And she's like, you know what? This is the best I've felt in years. And I swear to God, 10 minutes later, she is on the ground. She has this we find out she has this massive kidney stone that just kind of did its thing. And so we get her down the mountain, we get her to the hospital. They can't deal with it there, so they put her in an ambulance and drive her, 45 miles away to Loveland. And so, yes, last year was crazy, and there was a lot more funny stuff than that, but that's what it usually is for us. This summer was uneventful.
Thank God for uneventful vacations.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes. Dan, we talked last time about your journey to becoming an author, and you really had this. You have this funny way of looking at life and finding the humor in things, and you recorded a lot of that stuff in your book Dad Genius, and which is I think a very underappreciated book, because as someone who spends a lot of time, working from home with kids and family, I just laughed my butt off the whole time reading this book, and I think everybody ought to own a copy of it. But you really gave a look into, what your life is like, but your interesting way of viewing it. You also write kids books, and like we mentioned earlier, that really span a wide scope of different things. And one thing that makes your kids books so engaging is they're so funny.
Thank you.
You really get the kids' attention. You have them laughing, and you slide stuff right there into to them, and they've learned something. They don't even realize they've learned something because they're laughing, and they're so what do you think, where does that creativity come from for you? Have you always been this natural storyteller, and what do you think it is that helps you to connect with readers the way you do?
Well, thank you for all that. It's a good question. I think when I was a little kid, I would not have thought that I was a storyteller. I certainly would have thought that I was a kid who loved stories. And so I think that's the common ground that all of us writers have, that at some point we love stories a lot. And I love stories. And, I wasn't a kid who read all the classics. I just read what we had, and I read it over and over and over again. So I love stories. But I would say when I was teaching high school, is when I first realized how much I loved to tell stories. It was the part of teaching that I enjoyed the most, and I'm not sure I would have necessarily known that, but it just kind of happened. I found myself taking whatever we were doing and telling stories and realizing how much I enjoyed that part of it. So that's when I first became aware of really enjoying telling stories. That when I started teaching, that's when I realized I like to tell stories. I realized I was okay at it. The kids seemed to respond. And I don't know. I think then right at that point, I started becoming a parent. And when you have kids, you tell stories. And the more I did that, the more I realized I wanted to kind of tell stories of my own, maybe. So that was it.
Yeah. Last year when we talked, you had several kids' books out. You were working on a couple of different series. Over this last year, it's like your production and your productivity have just blasted through the roof. What has changed for you? What has happened that you just seem to be like a writer on fire right now?
Right. So I think part of it is things that maybe were produced or in the work of it. And then the other part of it is some of this me every day, and the only person who does that is me. I mean, my wife, she only checks in with me once a year. So, I think there's probably stuff I had in the past that people weren't aware of. And one thing I've been doing in the last year is trying to get some of my stuff up to a higher standard. So there's some things I saw that need refreshing, things that maybe needed a new pass on editing or a new look to covers. And so some of that has been going on. So when those things are ready and I start to release them, it looks like, oh my gosh, he's releasing stuff all the time. When, in essence, some of that has been due to just kind of getting things up to speed. And then the other part of it is I've had these picture books that I've been working on for a couple years and just kind of waiting for the right opportunity. Picture books, you could certainly write one fairly quickly, but there's more to it than that, and getting the right team together and the illustrator together and making sure you have the right approach. So I'm now in a spot where I feel better about how to release picture books. And so, since I've kind of got them ready, I'm able to release those more quickly. So that's part of it as well.
I think we have a lot of mutual friends that are, just having great success in the indie publishing space right now. And, there are certain genres that are absolutely on fire. And if you know how to write to market and you know how to, write stories that people want to read. Let's just put it that way. And you can cater to that, and you can find, certain success, pretty easily if you, get all the pieces of the formula together. And I'm not discounting that in any way. So please, nobody take it that way. Nobody take it that way. We're just talking about being smart writers, because we don't want to write things that nobody reads. That would be a waste of everybody's time.
Yeah, so yes,
me too. And that's a waste of everybody's time. But one of these kind of unknowns in indie publishing right now is kids books, because we don't have a lot of people that are doing it. And one of the we talk about in marketing and getting your whole indie author package together. You need to have great covers that catch people's attention, blurbs, all of that stuff. But we're usually talking to the people buying the books.
Yes.
And when you're writing for kids, you're talking to someone who's buying it that is not necessarily the person who is reading it.
Right.
What are some of the challenges that you've come up against, and how have you worked through that? And do you believe that kids books are viable for indie authors?
Yeah, so I think kids' books are viable for indie authors, but it probably looks a lot more like the traditional scene does, meaning there's probably more of an element of a lottery to it. Uh, Different from what you were just saying. There are some adult genre fiction areas where if you nail the basics and are productive enough, but you'll have success. There is no guarantee like that in kids' books, neither in the traditional world or in the indie world. So in that sense, I think they're more similar. It's still a tough go. But that being said, the people who seem to have success seem to fall in one of three categories. Number one, they've written a fantasy that has crossed over to adult fantasy readers. Now, the problem here is there's a lot of people who feel they have a fantasy novel in them. That's not a problem. I think it's an extension of the Harry Potter phenomenon. Harry Potter is something that people will read 50 years from now, and I don't know how many things like that published in the last 20 years we can say that about, right? So it's a cultural phenomenon. It's the kind of thing that has made a whole generation or two of people want to write books. And a lot of them end up writing a fantasy novel. And most of those never get read. And then every once in a while, one of those gets picked up and read by adult genre fantasy readers, and those have a chance, right, if they're good enough. Number two, that category of books that I would call early middle grade, so books that target reluctant readers or kids in the 8 to 10-year-old range. We're talking chapter books or things that are slightly between chapter books and traditional middle grade novels. Those books seem to have opportunity making the decisions. A lot of times those parents are trying to find books in series that their freaking kid will just read. I just want him reading. I just don't want him playing video games today. I'll just get any, right? So I think that category has a chance. And then the third seems to be picture books that help parents solve a problem. Picture books that tell great stories, which, I mean, let's be honest, from an artistic perspective, I think those are the picture books we would all like to read and create. But I think a lot of times the ones that do well are picture books that help adults solve a problem. So if you were an indie kids writer looking for something to write and have success with, those are the three areas that seem to do okay if you can nail it.
Do you see that that ebooks versus paperback are a big deal in kids? Most of the time, most genre fiction indie writers sell way more ebooks than they do paperbacks. Is that true in children's fiction as well?
Right, it's exact opposite, and the percentage seems to be the disparity seems to be growing more. 3 years ago said it's like 70% paperbacks to 30% ebooks. I bet it's closer to like 95% these days. And that seems to hold true with a lot of children's indie authors that I talk to. So that disparity is growing. Now, take the example of picture books. Obviously, picture books have a very low number of pages. So if you were in Kindle Unlimited, that doesn't help you out.
Right.
But on the other hand, if you happen to be one of the, I don't know what it is, like top 25 read picture books, then at the very least you could get one of those Kindle All-Star bonuses. And I mean, it doesn't make up for everything, but for the really good indie picture books, it's at least something. But no, I mean, it's all paperback, almost no ebook. It's crazy.
Well, does that affect your marketing? Since you're selling more paperback, are you still is Amazon still the 800-pound gorilla even in paperback kids sales?
Yeah, for sure. Because I don't have any of that data in front of me, but I mean, am I wrong to think that the last time I saw it was something like 70% of all book sales period were on Amazon? I mean, it was something like that,
yeah,
right?
I think that's
some
fair
big
to say.
number. And if I just had to guess, I would guess that holds true for kids books as well. I know there's probably a certain element of going to the bookstore for kids books still, but I gotta believe that it's around that 70% mark. My point being that, yes, it's still the 800-pound gorilla. It's still the best way to reach kids as an indie, with one caveat. I do know of some indie kids authors who have great success in piggybacking sales off of their school visits. I don't seem to know many who do great with events. I know you're going to find some, but people who have really figured out the kids' school visit thing. And I'm not one who has. I've just never put the work into it yet. But I know some people, it's a huge part of their business model, going to schools, sending along one of those pre-order forms as just part of the gig, and then selling books as part of it. I know, more than a handful that's a really big part of their business.
Well, I've talked to a lot of trad pub authors, and you ask, about, what do you do as an author to, to really make sure your book gets out there in front of people, and you just kind of get shoulder shrugs. It's like nobody really knows what makes a kid's book popular and why some seem to go viral and others don't. It's just kind of black magic out there. So the great news for that is if the traditional publishers haven't really cracked the code, then everybody has just as much a chance to have a book breakout as anybody else.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally right. Have you ever, by chance, I assume at some point you've picked up a Diary of a Wimpy Kid book,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Have you ever picked up any of the Timmy Failure books by Stephen, is it Pastis? I never know how to say his name.
I don't think we've had those in our house.
Okay. So he's the Pearls Before Swine creator.
Gotcha.
And the Timmy Failure books are written in the same style as the Wimpy Kid books, but they are, unbelievably well done and so funny. And if you've read Pearls Before Swine, you know how funny, at a deeply, sometimes dark level he is. But the Timmy Failure books are so good. But I don't think they've ever really sold that well. For a schlub like me, sure. But, here you have a big-time syndicated cartoonist, and I don't think they ever took off, which is my way of saying, even for the big guys, with all the money they have, I'll just agree with what you said. It's really hard to pick winners, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And then with picture books and stuff, which is such a tactile, visceral kind of buying experience when you open it up and flip through it and the kids see something they like, that it's, I would think that's even tougher. But, maybe kids are becoming more trained to shop Amazon, or maybe parents are just maybe it's just becoming people's buying habit. Maybe that's not the book buying experience anymore. Like when I took my little kids to the bookstore, because my kids aren't little anymore. But
right,
maybe we as the book buying culture are just retraining that.
Well, okay, so I have spent an insane amount of time over the last 6 years especially, which is the time period that I've been a stay-at-home dad, in my local Barnes & Noble. And so it's been fun. We have gone all the time. And so I wish I had one of those camera shots where, you like I don't even know what they're called, where they take a picture of the same place throughout the years and it shows the different seasons. I wish I had that of the Barnes & Noble, because you would see the entire store's inventory of books continuing to shrink and get taken over by toys, except for one spot. And that's the children's book section. It's no different than it ever was. It's the same size it's always been, and every other single part of the store is smaller. So I do think that tactile thing is still really important for kids' books, and especially for picture books. I still think it's a big deal. So certainly traditional publishers have an advantage, especially with picture books, especially the kinds of picture books that tell stories, because those are hard to slot in Amazon. It's not solving a particular problem in Amazon. It's the kind of thing where really browsing is the way you find something. So I still think that's really important for kids.
Yeah. We talked earlier about your book, Dad Genius, and
yes.
I'm sure that as someone who writes kids' books all the time, that you needed that creative outlet to tell a Dan story, to be a grown up for a minute,
right.
And you have recently launched a new book series under a pen name, Daniel
Yep.
Carson, and their Cozy Mysteries. And the first one, A Hopeless Murder, is absolutely fantastic.
Thank you very much.
I love this book. I'm about 3/4 the way through it. I got it a couple of days ago, and
well, that's great, because the last quarter sucks. So I'm glad you got through.
Well, good. I can move on to something else.
You can just move on.
Yeah.
You can just move on to book 2 whenever it comes out. That's great.
But one thing that I wasn't surprised, but I really enjoyed was it is so funny. It is so. I don't want to say lighthearted, because that's the wrong term. But you have characters that don't take themselves too seriously. Maybe is a way to. You've got this stuff going on, and characters that are in it, but kind of larger than it. First, what was your motivation for wanting to branch out and do adult books when you're so heavily invested in kids' books?
Right. Well, I mean, part of it is the conversation we've already had, which is kids' books are tough. They have unique challenges. And so I've always known that if there was an opportunity for me to write adult genre fiction that was a good fit for me, that long term it was probably a better way for me to make a sustainable living. Although, just saying that and saying to your writer is kind of funny. I mean, there's not much sustainable about it. I am the classic cliche of like the old 80s movies where the dad finds out the prospective boyfriend is a writer and just like screams his head off. Like I'm that guy, right?
Right.
How could you possibly take care of my daughter? But that being said, if you can do adult genre fiction, hit the tropes, meet readers' expectations, continue to try to get better as a writer, have some talent, and then have patience and be productive over a long time, I think you can make a living. And so a couple years ago, I just started to kind of look around and say to myself, if I was going to write adult genre fiction, what would I write? And I asked my wife if she thought, romance would be a good fit for me. And I think she laughed for like 10 minutes. And so I thought that was a good idea not to do romance after that. So I kept looking around, and I got to be honest, 2 years ago, I hadn't read a cozy mystery book, but what I discovered about myself was, in terms of my watching habits, cozy mysteries were the things I loved to watch on TV. That's what I love. Anything that resembles a cozy mystery, that's my thing. And once I figured that out, then I started reading the books and reading the genre. And after a while, I thought, I could do this. And I even figured out that one of my kids' series, The Math Inspectors, was essentially a cozy mystery for kids. And once I got behind that, I thought, I could really do this. And this is the kind of thing I wanted to find something that I would love to write and that I could write for a long time without getting tired of it. So that's how I came to the decision to do it.
Tell us, Dan, what defines cozy mystery? Because I'm sure I'd heard the term before, but up until a couple of years ago, I wasn't familiar with cozy mysteries either. And then when I first heard it, my initial thought was one thing, and then someone explained to me, well, think Agatha Christie.
Right.
Most of that would be cozy mystery. And I'm
Yep.
like, well, I love Agatha Christie. I think that's fantastic.
Yes.
Even a lot of Sherlock Holmes would be cozy mystery in a way.
Yes, in a way.
Yeah. What defines it for you?
Right. So I try to define it for myself the same way the genre tries to define it. So it does harken back to what people call the golden age of mysteries. So Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, people like that who were writing thinking people's mysteries. And in general, the violence that took place in these was off the page in general. So generally speaking, you came upon a murdered person, you didn't see a murder happening. And it was all about the intellectual puzzle of figuring it out how. Okay? That's kind of how it started. Now, these days, if you were to check the boxes of what makes something technically a cozy, the first thing would be the violence is pretty much off the page. In general, there's no sex, but if it was, it would only be alluded to off the page again. There's no swearing. Things are clean in that sense. Think Murder, She Wrote, Angela Lansbury, that TV show. That's the kind of vibe you're going for. And in terms of the cozy part of it, generally speaking, it happens in a locale, usually a smaller town, that is quaint and quirky and lovable and is the kind of place you might want to visit. It's cozy. And so those are generally – now, there's people who definitely stretch the bounds of that genre and bend from genre to genre. But I mean, that's traditionally what cozy mysteries are. Now, these days, there's lots of subgenres within cozies. So you might have an entire subgenre that deals with a protagonist. Oh, and I'm sorry, probably the biggest part of cozies, and I should have said this at the outset, is generally speaking, the protagonist is usually a woman, so it's usually a heroine, but not always, and usually is an amateur. So this is not a police procedural. This is not somebody who's collecting evidence and DNA in the usual way. This is somebody who's trying to put together an intellectual puzzle, usually by talking to people and asking questions. And so as an amateur, oftentimes people really highlight that person's vocation, their job. So do they have a unique job, or do they have a unique hobby or craft? There's a whole bunch of quilting mysteries. So what else can I say? So there's all these little subgenres. Does that paint a picture for you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So when you had this idea to do this, well, first off, when I started reading the book, I started looking at what is this book? What makes it stand out? What's Dan trying to do? I'm trying to kind of crack the code of what you're doing in this book. And first off, I got lost in the story, and I took my author stories hat off, and I just started reading the book because it was so funny, and so your Hope Walker, your main character, is just dynamite. She is one of the best drawn characters I've seen in quite a while, and I just loved her from the outset. but I started, thinking, I could write stuff like this. And then I said, I do write stuff like this. This is kind of the stuff that I don't write sex and, there's very little swearing and, most of my stories take place in this quaint little town. And, and I was like, man, I think Dan's onto something here. There's a lot of talk when you're in author groups and things like that. Most people have identified these genres that are really hot and that you can really, people are just doing phenomenal things in. And one of those, when you start talking about, books with female protagonists, a lot of those are, romances and some of them tend to trend toward the more, air quotes, adult, fare.
Sure.
And I think those things get a lot of attention, and there have been lots of authors that have taken a pen name and written stuff like that and made, a lot of money doing that.
Yep.
And I'm not judging them, but I don't think I could do that. It's just not, one, I wouldn't do it very well. And two, it would feel weird for me to try to do that because that's not the writer I am. Not saying other people can't do it. That's not the point. I wouldn't feel comfortable doing it. But I think that there are plenty of readers out there that are looking for exactly this kind of story. One that they can feel comfortable reading, one that that they don't hide from anybody,
right.
Things like that. I said all that just to, I guess, kind of reinforce what you already said. But just to say that I connected with that. I understand your love for it because I think a lot of us readers do love those kinds of stories. We want to get engaged in a story, and we don't want to feel like we compromise anything to do it. Is that safe to say?
It's very safe to say. Now, Dad Genius is an adult book.
Yes.
I mean,
there's
having
language
read that,
yeah.
There's language. It talks about marriage in a very frank way. It's not the kind of thing that my kids can read. Not yet. Oh, hopefully I'm dead before they read it. And as I state in the introduction, I really did not want my mom to read it. But what it is it's a really honest book.
Yeah.
That being said, I wanted to write something that, if my older kids wanted to read it, they could.
Yeah.
And so, I wanted to write something that my 17-year-old daughter, that I could feel good about her reading, and she read it and she loved it. And so that makes me feel great because, I write for a lot of people, but I've always written for my family and I've always written for my children. And it's just that they're a lot older than they used to be when I started writing. So I found myself writing new things. And again, I wanted something that I felt good about writing. And I mean, I wouldn't listen. I mean, I say this. I think we always have to say this. We are all broken people. None of us are perfect. And I'm really not perfect. So whenever I say anything like, I think that's wrong, I always say that with but I've done pretty much every wrong thing, right? So, I mean, I always think it's hilarious when people just, oh, you're a hypocrite. No, I've done pretty much every wrong thing, but I can still believe that some of the things I've done are wrong. And there's some things that I don't want to write. And I'm not just talking sex. I'm talking violence, even. When my wife and I walk out of a movie, I would say most of the time it's because the violence is too much these days. And at some point you're like, gosh, we've had enough, right?
Right.
And now that again seems ironic and hypocritical that I'm writing murder mysteries. But I think you get the picture, So yes, I wanted to write something that I could feel good about writing and having my kids and my family read for a very long time. That was the hope.
Yeah. And you're using a pen name.
Yes.
Just and it's no secret that this is actually you,
Nope.
but you're doing this to maintain integrity in the Amazon algorithms.
Right. And I think, you have a savvy listenership. I think a lot of people understand why. But for anybody who's not familiar with the idea, it's very simple. I write kids' books the people who buy my books, on any given week, Kleenex, deodorant, barbecue chips, tampons, men's husky underwear, who knows? I mean, and so that's sending a lot of different messages to Amazon about what kind of a buyer you are. And so if I were then to start writing cozy mysteries under that pen name, I think Amazon would have difficulty in knowing exactly who my readers were. On the other hand, in the world of Kindle Unlimited and subscription services, a cozy mystery reader, someone who reads that genre, they very well might read 150 books a year in that genre. And so, you want to make it crystal clear with your books and your tropes and your name what kind of readers you're going after. And I am very simply going after cozy mystery readers with this book. In fact, there were some people who knew I was writing, and I said, please don't buy my book. I'll just give one to you at some point. I don't, especially early on, I don't want to mess Amazon up. Yeah. That makes sense?
It makes perfect sense. And I think, like you said, we do have a savvy listening audience. I think they'll understand that. But what Dan is saying is absolutely true. You need, especially early in a book launch, the conventional wisdom is to sell as many books as you can. But the truth is you need to sell as many books as you can to the kinds of readers that normally read that kind of book, because
yes.
of the also bots that show up, under the book. You really want to get solidified in that genre. And if you've got someone who mostly reads, 18th century romance and they buy your book, then, maybe those also bots get mixed in there, and then
right.
your book is not being shown to the audience that's most likely to buy your book. And that's what you want. You want to sell your book to the people that are most likely to buy it. It's not discriminating. It's getting to the right people.
That's right. You want the right readers. The newer you are, the less of a following you are, the more important it is to have the right readers, not lots of readers.
Exactly.
Yep.
Where did the character of Hope Walker come from?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I really thought of the whole series and kind of, I wanted something that from the beginning I had enough steam that I could last 20 books. I wanted, having, dabbled in series before in my kids' side, I wanted to make sure that from the beginning I had enough architecture that I could last 20 books. Now, there is no guarantee that this series will provide a sustainable living for me, but I wanted to provide enough, stuff around it that if it seemed like it was taken off, I could go the full 20 books and go the distance. And that was kind of my starting premise. So from there, I wanted the kind of place, I think this is what a lot of authors do. What's the kind of place I want to visit? My wife and I on our honeymoon, we odd choice for most people around Omaha because that's not where they usually go. But that made it more fun for us. It wasn't, so we thought we were the only people in the world who would think of this. So we end up in some bed and breakfast, like really close to the Salmon River in northeastern Idaho. And we wake up the next morning, go down to breakfast, and there's this other couple staying with us. And we're like, oh, where are you guys from? They're like, Council Bluffs. And Council Bluffs and Omaha are 5 minutes away from each other. So we all had a very good laugh about that. But I think first off, I wanted the kind of place that I wanted to revisit over and over again. So I put it in the mountains of Utah. And then I needed a protagonist who had a story, who had a backstory, who had some pain, and who hadn't been back home for a while because of that. Because I just didn't want to start off from, hey, here's a perfect person. Now let's go start solving mysteries. I wanted there to be some more general series arcs along with there's a investigation in each book. So then that was the other piece of it. And then I thought to myself, I want a really tough woman who also is self-deprecating and has flaws, and has real people around her. As important as Hope was, it was just as important to me that I gave her a best friend in her best friend Katie that really made a lot of sense to me. And Katie, as you know, it's kind of my opportunity to talk about the domestic world that I've lived for the last 6 years as a stay-at-home parent. That's an opportunity for me to get a lot of myself and my family into the book. And so I really kind of looked at it as a collected whole. So that's what I would say.
Nice. So far you have one book out in the series. The first book is A Hopeless Murder,
Yep.
which is a funny pun on hope there in the title.
Yep.
Do you said that you envisioned a series that really had legs and would last a long time. What do you have presently planned for more releases in the Hope Walker series?
Yeah, so I tell you what, best case scenario, if I could release a book every month, that would be amazing. But I think what I've learned is I'm just not there yet. I'm not there as a writer. I'm not there as a producer. I'm not there with my family. So it's not an excuse. It's just reality. I mean, the excuse would be if I said, "Oh, I just don't have time." I mean, what I have is my life, and my life, like everybody's life, is really full right now, and I just can't put the work in at this point necessary to do a book a month, even though I know in this genre that would be best. That being said, I'm going to do the best I can, and I've figured out my strategy with my editor going forward. The next book will be out in late September. So book 2 will be out in late September, which, again, I know is not fast enough for cozy mystery fans, so I apologize. Hopefully, eventually I'll have enough out, and then they can catch up with the series. The third book will be out in late January of 2019. And then in 2019, it'll be fairly, I think, every 2 to 3 months that they'll come out. I feel pretty good about that. So,
in writing these, Dan, how much plotting goes into them?
Yeah, so the way I envision it is if I'm able to do a 20-book series, I've split it up in my head as 4 different 5-book seasons. And so each 5 books has a general sort of season arc that has to finish in, book 5, book 10, book 15, and then book 20. And so there was a certain amount of planning that went into that, but that had to do with kind of the architecture of the whole series. And then in terms of the plotting, I've used that first book as sort of my template for how I like to write these. And for me, I am not an outliner. I am definitely a plotter. But for me, it's a real kind of give and take process where I start with plotting and then I write to try and figure things out. And then I step back. And my plot is messed up at that point. And then at some point I hit the zone and then I'm good. But there's like an interplay that goes for me there. I think it's the same interplay that happens for all writers. They just call it something different. Like some people do all that stuff I'm talking about in a 40-page outline. And some people just pants it out. And I'm like some weird combination of dipping in and out of that. Does that make sense?
Well, I think a lot of writers feel that way, Dan. But I have discovered that what we feel like is that we're the exception to the rule. We are more the rule. People have this hybrid way of, my friend Chuck Manley says that he's a pantser with a plan.
I like that.
Yeah, I do too. I love it. I use it every chance I get. But I think that's the way most people operate. The people that are strict outliners, they're the rare ones, I think. And the people that just pants and have no idea what the story is about until they write it, I think they're kind of on the fringe as well. But I think most people have a general idea, and then they just, let their creativity flow between the pieces they know.
Totally. And I don't even know why I'm bringing this up, but I'm going to bring up Stephen King, so several things that annoy me. People who say Stephen King is a horror writer, I almost feel like they haven't read Stephen King. He's just a freaking amazing writer, right? And yes, he can describe dead bodies in the most revolting way possible, but that's not the same thing as being a horror writer. So that's the first thing that annoys me. The second thing, his descriptions sometimes are just from another planet, and they're so good. And, I love his writing so much, but of course, sometimes his books seem like the guy who doesn't know how to leave the party.
Right.
Right? Which is usually me. I'm that guy.
Yeah.
I feel like Harrison Ford, who is trying to talk and he doesn't know what to do, so he starts shooting the monitor. It's so awkward. That's me at the party. And I feel like that's Stephen King at the end of books. Because so often you get to the very end, you're like, it didn't quite end the way I was hoping. So you almost wonder if sometimes you could just have, and I don't know who's a crazy outliner, but somebody just come in and sprinkle some outline dust on his endings to help him a little bit. Not that a guy who's made $500 million needs my help, but
exactly.
That would be my opinion. So.
But yeah, it's almost like, if he just wouldn't have tried to end this book, but just kept it going and just let me live in his world, that would be better than this kind of awkward, meandering, landing that just didn't exactly stick.
Right, unless you're a made-for-TV Stephen King summertime series called Under the Dome, which, seriously, you're like, please stop this TV show. Yeah. How can it... Yeah, very funny.
Yeah, very funny. Well, Dan, we're looking forward to more books in the Hope Walker mystery series. I'm excited to see what you're going to do with the series. I'm excited. I'm excited to see how your creativity is branching out. For someone that's done so much in the kids space, to see just this new venture that you're doing, it really excites me, and it gives.
Thank you.
I think it gives a lot of people hope that you don't have to be pigeonholed as an author. That an author can love to do two different things at the same time and not be punished for it. I hope we see that. Yeah, no, I hope so too. There are. I do not have an author brand, right? I'm not the legal thriller guy. There's this great agent who years ago said, I just want your brand to be you're awesome. So I think the writers I really love are these writers who, Neil Gaiman, he's awesome, right? That's his brand. I know other people think he has a certain brand, but you read everything and you're like, that is crazy. Yeah, he's all over the place. The all over the placeness of it. So his brand is just awesome. I guess I would love, so mine is okay, right? But I would love to get to awesome. But so Hank, I know you got to get going, but you haven't asked one Raiders of the Lost Ark question. Are you trying not to alienate your audience? Well, I was just trying to live in grace and forgiveness and not bring that up. For those of y'all listening, Dan and I have a long-standing quarrel because I believe Raiders of the Lost Ark is the perfect movie, and Dan has a different experience. Yes, I have a different experience. So his experience is wrong. But yeah, so part of it is I like to be that guy a little bit, right? So that's part of it.
But the other part is I'm making a serious point, and the serious point I want to make is it's fun how things change over time, right? And it's just interesting to me, just as a learning experience, when you look back on things. Like, I love this idea of what holds up well, what doesn't hold up, and like what surprises you and what can you learn from that. So the last thing I'll say is Raiders of the Lost Ark is not a bad movie. Like I've always said to you, I just think it's an overrated movie. And here's my thing. The movie, basically, it's the first, like if you just had the first 10 minutes of the movie and then cut to Nazis' faces melting off, like that's essentially the movie that we remember as 12-year-old boys or teenagers watching it for the first time. Like that's our experience of the movie. The whole middle, it's kind of mushy in a way that Star Wars is never mushy. And that's my point.
Well, you have to be careful to not put too much weight on your memories. Let them. Sometimes it's better just let them be that, and don't try to, relive it. For sure.
Right. I got it. Okay, buddy.
Yeah. Dan, thanks for coming on. If people are just experiencing you for the first time, where can they find all of your stuff? We'll link up the Daniel Carson and your Dan Kenney stuff in the show notes. But do you have a central place where people can connect with you?
No, honestly, right now the best place is to go to Amazon, punch in my name, try my books out, see what I've written, or go on to Facebook and find either, Daniel Carson, author, Daniel Kenney. Those are the best places, honestly.
Excellent. And we'll do that. We'll link it all up. Dan, thanks so much for taking time to come back on the show.
Thank you, Hank. You're the best.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Natalie, it's Artie. Listen, I'm going to be late for dinner. I ran out of gas on... He climbed out of the car and peered at the sign. On Sleepy Hollow Road. There's nothing but trees, and I have to find a gas station. Save me a drumstick. He hung up his cell and stuck it in his pocket, zipping his jacket. He was going to have to walk and pray somebody picked him up. A sliver of crescent moon hung above, surrounded by clouds, like a grinning drunk asleep in a puddle. Artie walked, using his tablet as a flashlight, eyes on the gravel ahead. He crossed over a dark ravine. The trunks and overhanging branches were matted thick with wild grapevines and threw a cavernous gloom over the road. A figure stood at a crossroads ahead. It looked pale and wan and blue. A woman? He had an impression of fragility and age, and thought of his warty old landlady. But his landlady would not be standing at a crossroads in the dark. "Excuse me?" Artie said, surprised by the fear in his own voice. "Do you know where I can find a gas station? I'm empty." "Then let me fill you," the figure whispered. It rushed at him. It entered him. He dropped the tablet, fell to his knees, and lost his body to another driver. When Artie woke again, he was dangling in midair. The woods were pitch black. The only lights were fireflies. Fireflies everywhere, like dancing stars. He struggled and cried out, his yellow sneakers trying to find the ground. "Shh," said a voice. "It will all be over soon." Panic rose. He felt invisible hands on his legs, on his arms, invisible fingers around his neck, reaching up the back of his shirt. He heard the sound of water running below, high and agitated, as if through a stony brook. The crescent moon swung out of the sky, falling into the water. Blood rushed into his cheeks. He realized he had been flipped upside down. He yelled and groped, flecking his own face with spit, helpless to drive away whatever was attacking him. He felt a sharp pain between his shoulder blades, and air flew out of his lungs. A spray of blood hit his cheeks, hot and clinging. His hands found a sharp branch protruding from his body. It had speared him through his back and out through his chest. He tried to say help, but had no air to form the word. Blood poured up his body. No, it poured down. It only felt as if it were rising, climbing his neck, covering his face, gathering in his scalp. He reached for the ribbon of blood that fell from his crown into the trickle of moonlight below. The ribbon slipped through his fingers. It thinned, choked, became a tiny rivulet. His tanks were empty. Not even fumes. His engine began to sputter. The flow became a drip. A maddening drip like the drip, drip, drip of his kitchen faucet. The drip his landlady hadn't fixed. The drip that kept him up at night. This drip would not be keeping him up. He would sleep very well this night. Very well indeed. The fireflies slipped into shadow. A figure appeared, blue as gaslight, bony and toothless. A crone from a fairy tale.
"Thank you, my friends," she whispered. "I am thankful for this good harvest."
She neared, scrutinized him with manic intensity, and turned away, muttering to herself in a sing-song rhythm as she, too, vanished into the trees.
"A man may toil from sun to sun, but a woman's work is never done."